She walked across the stage in her dad's old coat, and the crowd mocked her. But seconds later, Keanu Reeves stood up from the audience, and what he did left everyone speechless. Welcome to the channel. Subscribe and like for more powerful stories. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. It was the kind of sunny morning that made everything feel possible. Warm light pouring through the windows, birds chirping with enthusiasm, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air like a good omen. Inside a modest two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, 18-year-old Samantha Dawson stood in front of the mirror, nervously adjusting her cap and gown. The dark blue fabric hung stiffly over her frame, the gold tassel gleaming in the morning sun. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of graduating, but from something deeper, something more difficult to admit. In the next room, her father, Gerald Dawson, hummed softly as he fumbled with the buttons of an old white shirt. It was pressed as best as he could manage with their $9 secondhand iron, but the fabric was frayed at the collar, and the cuffs had faint yellowing at the seams that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Over it, he wore a navy blue blazer, boxy, slightly oversized, with shoulder pads that whispered of the late 1980s. It was all he had. It was the blazer he had worn to job interviews, to Samantha's parent-teacher meetings, and to her middle school choir performance where she sang off-key but smiled like she owned the world. To him, it was more than a jacket. It was his armor, his story, his sacrifice. Samantha peeked out of her bedroom and saw her father adjusting his tie in the cracked hallway mirror. He looked proud, unapologetically proud. His posture was stiff, his chin slightly raised, as if trying to compensate for the way his clothes sagged and how they no longer fit the body shaped by years of warehouse shifts and janitorial work. She smiled softly, then quickly ducked back in. But deep down she was scared. Her school was not just any school. It was one of the top charter academies in the city, filled with students who drove Teslas to class, who posted Instagram stories from spring breaks in Cabo, who wore designer brands to prom and made sure everyone knew it. Samantha had worked harder than anyone else to get there. Scholarships, tutoring younger students, part-time jobs, and late nights filled with textbooks and tears. And her father had worked double shifts for 3 years just to cover what the scholarship didn't. He hadn't missed a single parent-teacher conference, not one school play, not one weekend tutoring session. But she knew that today someone would look at him and laugh. The school's graduation ceremony was being held at the Westbrook Civic Center, a stunning venue with crystal chandeliers, velvet seats, and a massive stage flanked by gold-trimmed curtains. It was as much a show of prestige as it was a celebration of achievement. The parking lot glistened with sleek black cars. Engines idling as valets in tuxedos greeted families dressed like they were attending a red carpet event. Gerald pulled the car into the lot, a battered, sun-faded Corolla with mismatched hubcaps and a rear bumper held in place with duct tape. Samantha could feel it, the stares, the invisible daggers of judgment. But she kept her chin up. Inside the Civic Center, students gathered backstage, buzzing with excitement. Friends hugged, selfies were taken, bouquets were exchanged early. Samantha stood near the edge of the group, her cap slightly askew, her heart pounding like a drum inside her chest. Her friend Maria, wearing a red dress under her gown and the newest iPhone sticking out of her Prada clutch, leaned over and whispered, "Is that your dad in the blazer? That thing's vintage." The word hit with the sting of a slap dressed as sarcasm. Samantha tried to laugh it off. "Yeah, it's kind of a signature look." "Oh, girl," Maria chuckled. "He looks like an extra in a 90s sitcom." The words came with a smirk. Another student nearby, Amber, who was known for her influencer-level online presence and designer obsession, snorted. "Honestly, it's brave of you to bring him here looking like that. People are definitely going to say something." Samantha's smile didn't reach her eyes. She excused herself and walked to the hallway outside, hands gripping the railing to steady herself. She could hear laughter behind her, whispers, someone making a joke about thrift store dads. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard it drew blood. But she wouldn't cry. Not today. Not on the day she earned the right to walk across that stage. Gerald, meanwhile, had made his way to the auditorium with a folding camcorder in one hand and a rose tucked under his arm. He took a seat in the middle of the audience, the worn blazer stretched tightly across his back. He smiled at everyone who made eye contact, blissfully unaware of the side glances, the raised eyebrows, the silent comments exchanged between better-dressed guests. One woman in a sequin dress whispered to her husband, "He looks like he wandered in from a bus station." Behind them, sitting quietly in the last row with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, Keanu Reeves watched everything unfold. He hadn't come to be noticed. He had come for someone special, a scholarship student he had secretly funded through a private initiative for underprivileged youth. He didn't want anyone to know he'd be there. But as he observed the room, he felt the energy shift. He noticed the eyes flicking toward Gerald, the low murmurs, the judgmental stares. And then he noticed something else. Samantha stepped onto the stage with a grace that belied her nerves. Her name was called, and the audience clapped politely. She looked out at the sea of faces and found her father. He stood up briefly and waved the camcorder, smiling like it was the proudest moment of his life. Samantha smiled back, her heart caught between overwhelming love and quiet shame. Then she heard it, a snicker, a loud, unmistakable snort of laughter from one of the front rows. "Who let that janitor in?" someone whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. The moment froze. Keanu sat forward in his seat. His jaw tightened. His eyes burned with focus. That voice didn't belong to someone defending dignity. It belonged to someone who believed worth was worn on the outside. And Keanu had seen enough of the world to know that sometimes all it took was one voice, one calm, unexpected voice, to change the temperature of a room. But he didn't rise. Not yet. He waited, because he knew the right moment was coming. And when it did, they wouldn't just see a girl and her father. They would see something sacred, something unshakable, something the world had forgotten. The sound of his chair sliding back was soft, but it cut through the auditorium like thunder. Keanu Reeves stood, and in that instant, the auditorium, packed with hundreds of whispering, scoffing, distracted people, fell into an eerie hush. The laughter from the front rows dried up mid-breath. The murmurs about Eliza's clothes evaporated like mist under sunlight, and the faint clicks of smartphones capturing her humiliation were suddenly frozen in midair. Every eye pivoted toward the back of the hall, struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. Was it really him? In a simple black suit, no tie, his salt and pepper beard perfectly trimmed, and an unmistakable presence carved from a lifetime of humility and greatness, Keanu Reeves took a step forward into the central aisle. The soft glow from the stage lights caught his silhouette. There was no spotlight. There didn't need to be. The air itself seemed to lean toward him. Eliza's body stiffened on stage. She squinted into the audience, struggling to see beyond the brightness. But she recognized the figure instantly. Her heart skipped. Her knees almost buckled beneath her. Was this real? Was he really here? It was the man who had once spoken gently to her after a fan event years ago, who had told her that kindness mattered more than applause. The man whose movies she had grown up watching with her dad on their beat-up couch. The man her father always said was the one Hollywood star who actually walked the talk. And here he was, walking toward her. Gasps rippled across the crowd like a wave crashing toward the shore. Phones rose again, but this time not out of mockery or malice. Now they were trembling in hands. No one knew what to say. The principal stood paralyzed, his mouth ajar, fingers gripping the edge of the podium like it might keep him from drowning. Keanu reached the edge of the stage. He placed one foot on the bottom step, his movements as composed as a mountain. Then another step, another, until he was standing on stage beside Eliza, shoulder to shoulder with the girl who, just moments ago, was alone and stripped of dignity. He didn't take a microphone. He didn't need to. He looked at Eliza, not with pity, but with a silent strength that wrapped around her like armor. His voice came, low and warm, just for her. "You don't have to explain anything. You've already made your father proud." Her throat tightened. Her lips trembled. But somehow, with Keanu standing next to her, the ache in her chest eased. She wasn't invisible anymore. The principal finally found his voice. "Mr. Reeves, sir, I didn't realize." Keanu turned slowly And when he faced the principal, it wasn't with anger. It was disappointment, and it hit harder than any raised voice could. That she didn't belong here? He asked calmly. Because of what she's wearing? No, that's not. I just meant there's protocol, standards, the man stammered. Keanu raised a single brow. And humiliating a student in front of her entire class? That's the standard. The principal wilted, words drying up on his tongue. And then Keanu turned to the audience. No spotlight moved, but the entire auditorium seemed to brighten. You all saw it, he said. You watched a young woman stand here, trembling in her father's worn dress shirt, trying to smile through shame. And instead of offering kindness, many of you laughed, whispered, recorded her embarrassment. What? A long pause. No one answered. Because of a wrinkled shirt, he continued. Because the tie wasn't designer? Because she didn't come wrapped in the right kind of fabric? Silence. I've worn suits worth more than cars, Keanu said. I've stood on red carpets and in billion-dollar boardrooms. But nothing I've ever worn has meant more than the flannel shirt my dad gave me before he died. Because clothes don't carry value. People do. He turned to Eliza again. Your father gave you what he had, and you honored him by wearing it here. That is love. That is courage. Someone in the back of the hall clapped. A single clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted, not in polite applause, but in a standing ovation. A roar of human acknowledgement. And at the center of it all stood Eliza, her hand covering her mouth as tears finally fell. Keanu leaned toward her. You have nothing to hide, he whispered. You walk tall now. She nodded through the tears. She had never felt smaller than she had just minutes before, but now, standing next to him, she had never felt taller. As Keanu began to walk away, Eliza caught his hand. Why did you come? He smiled gently. Because someone needed to remind them what respect really looks like. And then he was gone, his footsteps quiet, his presence lingering like a warm shadow behind her. But the energy in the room had shifted. The same students who had scoffed were now staring at the floor. The girls who had whispered cruel things suddenly looked guilty, and the boys in their expensive suits sat back down in silence, unsure where to look. The principal cleared his throat. Let's continue the ceremony, he said, voice shaking. Miss Eliza Grayson, valedictorian. This time, when Eliza stepped forward, the applause was thunderous. And this time, she walked forward without hesitation, because she wasn't wearing shame anymore. She was wearing honor. The moment Kira walked onto that stage, it should have been the proudest of her life. But pride can be fragile when placed in the crosshairs of judgment. As her name echoed across the auditorium, it was followed not by applause alone, but by something colder. A ripple of amusement. A stifled laugh here, a scoff there. Small at first, but small things can grow. And the moment she stepped onto the stage with her father's oversized brown coat draped over her slim graduation gown, worn like armor, it began. The coat hung awkwardly on her frame. It swallowed her shoulders and brushed the tops of her black dress shoes. Most of her classmates had opted for sleek dresses or tailored suits beneath their robes. Kira, on the other hand, looked like someone had stitched the past onto her like a memory she couldn't shed. The coat was worn thin at the elbows, the wool pilled, the buttons mismatched. But it was clean. It smelled of cedar and age and her father's cologne, a scent that reminded her of every hard-earned sacrifice he'd made to get her to this very moment. The principal extended a hand to shake hers. The photographer gave the nod. But just as she took her place for the photo, a sharp voice called from the audience. Did she just walk up here in a trench coat from 1940? Laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. Enough to pierce through the bravado she had mustered to stand there. The kind of laughter that doesn't fade quickly. It stays, it echoes, it multiplies. Her eyes flinched, but her smile remained frozen, a practiced mask. Click! The photo was taken. But in that instant, something in her shattered. She stepped down from the stage in silence, walking stiffly, holding the diploma folder to her chest, as if trying to protect something delicate inside her. Her robe swept behind her, the coat fluttering slightly in the air-conditioned breeze, and she could feel it. The glances, the nudges, the whispers turning into murmurs, the murmurs into chuckles. She really wore that. Looks like she mugged a homeless person on the way here. Her dad couldn't iron it or afford a real one. The comments didn't come from one person. They never do. They came from everywhere. A collective permission to judge that spread like wildfire once the first spark was lit. And then came the phones. One flash, then another. Someone zoomed in. Someone else whispered, "Tag her on TikTok," as they snickered and crouched to get a better angle. Kira didn't look up. She couldn't. Her chest was tight. Her hands trembled as she slid into the metal folding chair beside her classmates. She had worked so hard, studying by the flicker of candles when the power went out, balancing multiple jobs to help pay the bills, walking an hour to school when the car broke down and her dad couldn't afford the repairs. And yet, all anyone could see was a coat. Behind her, Gregory watched helplessly. He saw the smirks. He heard the laughter. He saw someone point directly at him. A woman nudged her husband and whispered behind a manicured hand, "That must be your dad." Figures. Gregory had never felt more visible and invisible all at once. He had ironed that coat 3 times that morning. He'd even brushed off the lint with a sticky roller Kira had bought from the dollar store. He thought it looked nice, respectful. It was the best thing he owned. When Kira had insisted on wearing it over her robe, saying, "It's yours, and you're part of this moment," he had been stunned. Touched. Now he felt like a fool. And yet, there he sat, back straight, hands resting nervously on his thighs, proud and heartbroken all at once. He didn't move, didn't raise his voice, but his eyes, his tired, grateful eyes, followed his daughter with a tenderness no insult could undo. Then, one of the students seated beside Kira turned to her and asked, too loudly, "Why would you embarrass yourself like that on graduation day?" Her voice was wrapped in sarcasm. Was the thrift store closed or something? Kira blinked. Once. Twice. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came. Her throat was dry. The lump was rising. She clenched her jaw, trying not to cry. Not here. Not now. She had promised herself she wouldn't let them get to her. But promises like that crack under pressure. "I wasn't trying to be fashionable," she whispered. "What were you trying to be then?" the girl asked with a mocking smile. "Grateful," Kira replied. Her voice wavered, but her words didn't. The girl rolled her eyes and turned away, clearly disappointed that the moment hadn't escalated into something more dramatic. Kira lowered her gaze, blinking rapidly, trying to will the tears back into her heart where they wouldn't show. She reached into her robe pocket and touched a small, folded piece of paper. It was a letter her father had written her the night before graduation. A letter she hadn't yet opened. Maybe she was saving it for afterward. Maybe she had feared what it would make her feel. But now, more than ever, she needed a reminder of something good, something real. As she unfolded it slowly, careful not to wrinkle it, a single line caught her eye. It was written in Gregory's uneven script. "People might laugh at the way we dress, Kira, but they'll never understand how hard we work to earn what we wear." She let out a shaky breath. That was her dad. Simple, honest, strong in quiet ways. And yet, even with those words in her hand, the weight of the moment threatened to consume her. The laughter, the photos, the judgment, it wasn't stopping. And as the next name was called, followed by another, and another, Kira realized her humiliation had become the silent center of the ceremony. Until a soft murmur rippled through the far end of the audience. Movement. From the back row, someone stood up. Not Gregory, not another parent, but a man, tall, dressed in all black, wearing a quiet expression that seemed both curious and concerned. It was Keanu Reeves, unannounced, unnoticed until now. Most had assumed he was simply another guest, perhaps a relative. But now, as he rose to his feet and walked slowly toward the center aisle, eyes began to follow him. The whispers turned. "Wait, is that?" "No way. It is. That's Keanu Reeves." But no one knew why he was there. Not yet. Not until the next moment unfolded, and not until the laughter would stop for good. Because Keanu hadn't stood to join in. He had stood to stand up for someone. And what would happen next would change the meaning of that entire graduation forever. It wasn't dramatic at first. No booming music, No gasps of recognition, just a subtle shift like the world had suddenly decided to hold its breath. Keanu Reeves walked down the aisle of the graduation ceremony slowly, deliberately, as though each step were a statement in itself. The soft tap of his boots against the polished gymnasium floor echoed louder than the applause that had followed any student before. Students turned. Parents leaned sideways in their folding chairs. Even the faculty at the front of the stage paused, their eyes narrowing in confusion, trying to understand what was unfolding in front of them. Kira didn't see him at first. She was still hunched slightly in her seat, hands clenched in her lap, that folded note from her father resting like a fragile anchor between her fingers. The echoes of laughter still clung to her ears. The girl beside her whispered something again, but Kira didn't hear it. She was somewhere else, somewhere deep in the quiet, trying to hold herself together. And then a shadow fell across her. She looked up and blinked again. Keanu Reeves. The real Keanu Reeves. Not on a screen, not in a dream. Standing right in front of her, in this tiny high school gym packed with fold-out chairs and budget decorations and kids who had laughed too loud a few minutes ago. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, not with pity, not with sympathy, but with something more powerful, recognition. She glanced behind her, thinking maybe he was looking at someone else. But no, his gaze stayed on her. "You don't mind if I sit here, do you?" he asked softly, gesturing to the empty, folding chair beside her. The girl who had mocked Kira earlier sputtered something unintelligible and immediately shifted to the next seat, leaving the chair open like it had suddenly become sacred ground. Keanu sat beside Kira without ceremony, without announcement. He didn't look around to acknowledge the dozens, now hundreds, of eyes fixed on him. He didn't nod at the cameras that were slowly being pulled from pockets, nor the murmur of whispers growing louder in the background. He only looked at Kira. "You handled that with grace," he said, voice low. "Not many people could." Kira opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her throat burned. I don't understand," she finally managed. He smiled gently. "I was invited to speak today. I told them I'd rather just watch. Sometimes you learn more by being quiet." Kira stared at him. She could hardly process what was happening. The surreal nature of it, the reversal of everything that had just occurred. She wasn't even sure what he was doing here. This Hollywood icon sitting beside her like he'd been waiting all along. "I saw what happened when you walked on stage," he continued, nodding toward the platform. "The way you held yourself, the way you didn't flinch. That meant something." Kira looked down at her hands. The note, the coat. "This is my dad's," she said quietly, as if defending herself before another insult could come. "He couldn't afford a suit for today. He said I could wear his best coat." Keanu glanced at the garment draped over her shoulders. He nodded again, slower this time. "It suits you," he said. From behind them, someone muttered, "What the hell is going on?" Someone else whispered, "Is this for a movie?" Kira shook her head in disbelief. "They were laughing at me." Keanu's expression didn't change. Sometimes people laugh because they don't know what strength looks like, so they mock it. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Keanu stood again. He didn't raise his hands or ask for a microphone. He didn't need one. His presence alone quieted the room. He looked toward the crowd, his voice steady but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he began, "but I feel like something important just happened, and we missed it." Heads turned. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Teachers at the front exchanged confused glances. Even the principal rose halfway out of his chair, unsure if he should approach or let it unfold. "This young woman," Keanu continued, nodding at Kira without gesturing too grandly, "walked onto this stage with pride. Not for herself, but for her father. She were something that meant something." More murmurs. "And instead of celebrating that pride, what did we do?" he asked, his tone now heavier, more deliberate. "We laughed." A wave of silence swept over the auditorium, the kind that hurts more than sound. "There's a kind of courage," he went on, "that doesn't show up in movies. It's not flashy. It doesn't punch bad guys or drive fast cars. It's quieter. It walks up to a stage, knowing it's going to be judged, and does it anyway." Kira felt her breath catch in her throat. "It's easy," Keanu said, to wear designer suits, to walk in clothes that were stitched by someone else's hands. But when you walk in something woven by sacrifice, when you wear a coat that was earned, not bought, that's the kind of story people should remember. Now you could hear sniffles, actual sniffles, from parents, from students, even from a few teachers. Kira wasn't crying, but her eyes glistened in that same way they had earlier. Except this time, they weren't filled with humiliation. They were filled with something else, a kind of relief, maybe even pride. Keanu turned toward the faculty. I won't take up any more time. I just wanted to say this. When a room full of people laughs at the wrong thing, it takes one person doing the right thing to change the story. He looked down at Kira again. You did that, he said softly. And then, without asking, without waiting for applause, Keanu did something no one could have expected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. A pin, gold-plated, subtle. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't an award. It was a tiny lapel pin in the shape of a phoenix. He handed it to her. This is something I was given once when I was at my lowest. I've carried it for years. I think it belongs to you now. Kira took it with shaking hands, the cool metal settling into her palm like a piece of someone else's legacy, and suddenly becoming hers. Then Keanu nodded once more, took his seat beside her again, and said nothing else. The crowd didn't erupt. There was no applause. There was just a moment, a stillness, like the world had finally remembered how to be quiet in reverence of something real. And in that stillness, Kira looked down at the pin, then at her father's coat, and smiled. For the first time all day, it wasn't a mask. It was hers. The ceremony continued, but something had changed. It was subtle, unspoken really, but real, like the air had been cleared of something heavy. The energy had shifted. Students who'd once leaned away from Kira now stole glances at her, their expressions softer. The laughter that had echoed through the auditorium minutes before had been replaced with a tentative silence. Not awkward, not forced, just respectful. But Kira barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, spinning, reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Keanu Reeves had stood up for her, not just with a gesture, not just with words. He had seen her. He had seen her father's coat, not as a source of embarrassment, but as a symbol of strength. And more than that, he had turned humiliation into honor. She looked down at the phoenix pin, now clipped to the inside seam of the coat, just above her heart. It caught the light every so often, like a tiny sun. And in that moment, she made a decision. She stood up, not loudly, not for attention, but for truth. The MC at the front of the stage had just called out the next valedictorian, but when Kira rose, the microphone was gently lowered. One of the faculty members leaned in, hesitating. Kira, are you all right? She nodded. I think I'd like to say something. The principal stood from his seat and whispered something to the MC. After a brief exchange, the mic was handed to her. The decision had been made. After what had just happened, no one was going to deny her the right to speak. She stepped up to the podium. Her knees trembled, but her spine stayed straight. My name is Kira Martin, she said, her voice wavering slightly at first. And I wasn't supposed to give a speech today. I'm not top of my class. I'm not the captain of anything. And I don't have a scholarship to announce. A few uncomfortable chuckles murmured from the audience. But she didn't flinch. I wasn't even going to attend today, she continued, because I didn't think I belonged. She paused. I didn't think I looked right. I didn't have a new dress or polished shoes. I didn't have designer makeup or hair done at a salon. All I had was this. She gestured to the coat, my dad's jacket. The room fell completely still. Kira took a deep breath. My father isn't rich. He doesn't drive a fancy car. He works construction, and sometimes he does janitorial shifts at night to help pay our bills. He has blisters on his hands and bad knees from climbing scaffolding. He gave up college so I could go. And this, she touched the fabric of the coat with trembling fingers, was the nicest thing he owned. So when he saw me getting dressed this morning and asked what I'd be wearing, I told him I didn't have anything. He went to the closet, pulled this off the hanger, and said, "Then wear this. I want you to wear something that's been through something." Her voice cracked. The silence in the gym grew heavier, fuller. I didn't understand what he meant until I walked up here earlier, and people laughed. She didn't need to name names. She didn't look toward the section of students who had sneered and whispered. She didn't have to. They laughed because they saw something different, something they didn't recognize as beautiful. Kira looked up then, her chin lifting slightly, her voice growing steadier. But Keanu was right. This coat has been through something. It's been through layoffs and injuries, cold nights and long shifts. It's soaked in sweat and sacrifice. And I wore it because I wanted to carry that with me today. She glanced down at the Phoenix pin and smiled, tears welling in her eyes. My dad taught me that the things that last aren't always the things that shine. Sometimes the strongest things are the ones no one notices until they're tested. That's what this coat is. And that's what my dad is. A few muffled sobs could be heard in the crowd now. Mothers reaching for tissues, fathers swallowing hard. The couple that had defended Kira earlier held hands tightly. The elderly man in the navy blue suit nodded solemnly, his jaw clenched. And I know, Kira added softly, that he couldn't be here today. He had to work. He's probably still on a job site, pouring concrete or sweeping floors or fixing something broken. But Dad, if you ever see this... She looked up, her voice trembling. I wore your coat, and they saw me. A hush fell, so deep it felt like even the walls were listening. Kira stepped back from the mic slowly, almost afraid to break the moment. But as soon as she did, something remarkable happened. It started with a single clap, from the back row, then another, and within seconds, the entire gymnasium stood to its feet. It wasn't the kind of applause you hear after a good performance. It wasn't polite or obligatory. It was reverent. It was grateful. It was the kind of applause that people give not to a speaker, but to a truth they needed to hear. Keanu stood too. He didn't clap. He just bowed his head slightly, like a soldier honoring a flag. His face was unreadable, calm, yet clearly moved. He didn't take the spotlight again. He didn't have to. Kira had taken it, and she had turned it into something holy. She returned to her seat, and for the first time in hours, no one dared whisper around her. Not out of fear, out of respect. Minutes later, when the ceremony concluded, dozens of people, classmates, parents, even faculty, came to her. Some shook her hand. Some hugged her. One mother wept openly and apologized for laughing when Kira had walked on stage. A teacher told her she had said what no adult had been brave enough to say for years. But the most meaningful moment came just after the crowd began to thin. As Kira stepped out into the bright sunlight of the school parking lot, blinking against the heat, a sound caught her attention. A horn. She turned, and there he was, her father, still in his work boots, pants dusted with white concrete powder, shirt damp with sweat, standing beside his old pickup truck. His hard hat rested on the dash, and his eyes, his beautiful, weathered, tear-glass eyes, were locked on her. She ran. Across the parking lot, across the cracks in the pavement and the grass that had grown wild along the edges. She didn't care who saw her. She didn't care that cameras were still rolling or that students were watching. She ran into his arms like she was 5 years old again. He caught her, held her tight, and when he pulled back to look at her, he saw the pin. He touched it gently, confused. What's this? Kira looked up at him and smiled, her eyes still swimming. A gift, she whispered. From someone who sees the world the same way you do. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. He just nodded, pressed his hand to her shoulder, and whispered, I'm proud of you, baby. She looked down at the coat. And this time, when the wind blew through the parking lot and lifted its hem ever so slightly, she didn't tug it down. She wore it like armor. The crowd had long since begun to thin. Caps had been tossed. Photos had been taken. Hugs exchanged. The celebratory noise of graduation faded into the afternoon, leaving behind the slower rhythm of real life. Cars starting up, folding chairs scraping against gym floors, the subtle sound of tired shoes dragging across pavement. But for Kira Martin, the world had never felt more alive. She stood next to her father by the truck, his rough hand still resting protectively on her back, as if the moment might try to escape them. She hadn't said much after that first tear-filled embrace. She didn't need to. He had looked into her eyes and seen everything. Her pride, her pain, her fight, and the jacket, the very one he had handed her just hours before, never knowing what it would come to symbolize, now rested over her shoulders like a mantle passed down not just from one generation to the next, but from struggle to survival. She glanced up at him, about to speak, when a voice called from behind. "Excuse me." They turned. It was the elderly man from inside, the one who had nodded throughout her speech, who had clapped before anyone else had dared. He was walking slowly, but with intention, his cane clicking gently against the pavement. "I didn't want to leave," he said, without shaking her hand. Kira stepped forward, extending her hand with reverence. But instead of shaking it, the man held it between both of his, gently, like something sacred. "I've seen a lot of speeches in my lifetime," he said, his voice husky but clear, "but very few that reminded me what dignity looks like." She blinked back tears. "Your father raised a remarkable woman." Her dad tried to speak, but only managed a humble nod, pressing his lips together tightly to hold back the emotion. The man smiled once more, then gave her hand a final squeeze before turning and disappearing into the flow of families packing their trunks and taking selfies by the school's crest. Kira exhaled slowly, and, just as she was about to climb into the truck, another sound caught her ear. Footsteps. Measured. Calm. Familiar. Kira turned. It was Keanu Reeves, still in the same plain clothes. Still somehow both completely anonymous and unmistakably him. He walked toward them, hands in his pockets, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said gently. Kira's dad looked stunned. "Wait, is this?" Kira nodded, her voice suddenly a whisper. "Yeah, that's him." Keanu extended his hand to her father. "Mr. Martin," he said, "your daughter honored you in there today." Her father hesitated a second too long before accepting the handshake, his mind clearly still processing the surreal nature of what was happening. She's the one who should be proud." "Oh, I think she is," Keanu said, eyes twinkling slightly. "And you should be too." Then, turning to Kira, he asked, "Do you mind if I borrow your dad for just a second?" Kira blinked. "Of course not. I'll be right over here." As she stepped away, she caught the exchange between the two men from a short distance. She couldn't hear the exact words. Keanu was speaking low, intimate, like the moment was meant to belong to just them. But she saw her father's face soften, then harden, then melt altogether. And when Keanu placed a hand on her father's shoulder, the older man pulled him into a brief but deeply felt hug. After a quiet moment, they returned. "I just wanted to say thank you," Keanu said to her again, "for reminding people what honor looks like when it's worn on your sleeves." Kira smiled shyly. "You're the one who stood up for me first." "No," Keanu replied. "I just lit a spark. You carried the flame." She looked down, a blush coloring her cheeks. "And this," he gestured to the phoenix pin still gleaming at the edge of her coat, "that's not just for today. Keep it, because you'll have other moments in life when the world won't understand what you're wearing or why you're standing tall while everyone else sits. This is for those days." "I won't forget," she said. "I know." He nodded once to her father, then turned to go. And as quietly as he'd arrived that morning, Keanu Reeves walked away. No entourage, no camera flashes, no curtain call. Just a man who saw something good and decided to honor it. Kira and her father stood in silence, watching until he disappeared past the gate of the school grounds. And when they finally climbed into the old pickup, it wasn't just a drive home. It was a journey forward. 3 months later, the clip went viral. It started as a cell phone video, grainy, a little shaky, captured by someone in the audience who had been live streaming the graduation to their cousin across the country. At first, only a few thousand people watched. Then the numbers doubled, tripled. Within 2 days, the clip had been viewed over 10 million times. Not because it featured a celebrity, but because it captured something rare. The moment a girl was laughed at and stood taller. The moment an actor stood up and made the world sit down. The moment an old coat became the most beautiful thing on that stage. News outlets ran stories. Graduation speech turns viral after Keanu Reeves honors student's father's coat. From humiliation to inspiration. the speech that silenced a room. Kira Martin's story is the reminder we all needed about grace. Interviews followed. Invitations from talk shows. Colleges reached out. A local nonprofit even offered her a paid summer internship focused on youth advocacy. But the best part? None of it changed her. Kira still walked with the same quiet strength, still wore the same shoes, still helped her father with groceries. And when she was asked what she'd do next, her answer was simple. I want to make spaces safer for people who feel like they don't belong, because I know what that feels like. And she did. In the fall, she enrolled in college with a partial scholarship gifted by an anonymous donor. Though she had a strong suspicion, she knew who it was. During orientation week, she wore the same coat her father had given her, not for attention, but because it had walked with her through fire and come out whole. And on its lapel, pinned like a compass pointed inward, sat a shining phoenix. Proof that some things rise higher, precisely because they've been through the ashes. So if you ever feel like you don't fit in, if you've ever been laughed at for what you wore or where you came from, if the world tries to define you by what you lack instead of what you carry, remember this story. Remember Kira. And remember that sometimes the strongest thing you can wear is your truth. Because as Keanu reminded us that day, the coat doesn't make the person, but the story behind it, that's where real power lives. And that power, it lives in you.